Good morning, everybody. We'll be getting started here in just a few seconds. We're just waiting for more people to join. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our Stakeholder Engagement Kickoff meeting for AB 3088. My name is Veronica Harms, and I'm the Deputy Secretary of External Affairs at the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. I just want to thank you all for being here with us today. I know people are still joining us, but I'd like to start off with a quick poll to see where everyone is and who they represent. So on the screen, I'll be pulling up a poll, and if I can have you fill it out, we'll see where everybody is coming from today. Leave it open for just another 5 seconds. So looks like right now we have a lot of people from the housing related organizations. That's great, and local jurisdictions. We'll be closing that, and here's who's on our webinar today. So thank you again for joining. We look forward to a fruitful conversation today. We'll have another poll just to see what regions you guys are representing today. And let's see where you're all sitting. About 5 more seconds. And looks like we have a great representation from the Bay Area and also Superior, California. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. There'll be 2 more poll questions in the middle of our webinar today. I'd like to get started with our agenda for today. We will be talking, doing some brief introductions, giving an overview of the purpose of this meeting, and setting the stage of what the current housing market looks like in California. overview of potential federal funding, and also talk about why we are here today to initiate our stakeholder engagement process, and then open it up for questions at the end of the day. We will be using the chat function to answer any questions, and for the questions we don't get through, we will be compiling an FAQ that will be posted on our website. There should be a link in the chat function right now with where we're housing our meeting materials. And so you could go and take a look, and we'll be sending an email after today's webinar with the link to all the materials as well. So before, I'd like to also introduce our panelists today. Thank you. If you can just, I have all their cameras off right now, but we will be joined today with Lourdes Castro Ramírez, the Secretary of the Business, Consumer Services and Housing Agency, Jason Elliott, the Senior Counselor to the Governor for Housing and Homelessness, Irina Esmunsen, Chief Economist for the California Department of Finance, and Lynn Von Koch-Leibert, the Deputy Secretary of Housing for the Business, Consumer Services and Housing Agency. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, today's meeting, the purpose of today's meeting, as I mentioned earlier, is to initiate the stakeholder engagement on the Tenant, Homeowner, and Small Landlord Relief and Stabilization Act of 2020, also known as AB 3088. We'll be providing some housing context to solicit feedback so that we have some great feedback on our survey. We'll be reviewing and understanding the potential federal housing related to stimulus funding, and then also outline the timeline and parameters for our feedback that we're going to be requesting of you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Secretary Lourdes Castro Ramírez to kick off the meeting.
Okay, good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Veronica, so much for the introduction and for facilitating today's convening. As Veronica mentioned, I'm Lourdes Castro Ramírez, and I serve as the Secretary of the Business, Consumer Services and Housing Agency. And I'd like to just start off by expressing again a sincere welcome and thank you for joining us today as we kick off this stakeholder engagement process that is meant to inform the overall state's efforts with regard to the Tenant, Homeowner, Small Landlord Relief and Stabilization Act of 2020, also known as AB 3088. We are grateful that you're able to join us, and we look forward to the valuable feedback throughout this process. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the leadership of the governor and the legislature. Together with stakeholders, they identified the solutions and the protections afforded by AB 3088. Not only did these efforts avert the significant harm and displacement of tenants in our state, but they also created the impetus for the conversations that are being set into motion today. Thank you also to the bill authors, the committee chairs, and the many staff members that were involved in this process. And many thanks to all of you for your continued engagement and partnership. I also would like to express our appreciation to the governor's office, to Senior Counselor for Housing and Homelessness, Jason Elliott, who you will be hearing from shortly, and also Mark Tollefson in the governor's office, and our Deputy Secretary for Housing, Lynn Von Koch-Leibert, who you also will be hearing from, and of course our partners in the Department of Finance. Now, I'd like to just spend a few minutes providing some background and context to set the stage for why we're here today. As many of you know, on August 31st, 2020, the legislature passed and the governor signed into law California Assembly Bill AB 3088, also known as the Tenant, Homeowner, and Small Landlord Relief and Stabilization Act of 2020. The new law includes eviction protections that apply to all residential tenants, including mobile home tenants, regardless of immigration status. It provides protection from eviction for tenants unable to pay their rent due to financial hardship resulting from COVID-19 or the COVID-19 pandemic, And these protections are afforded through February 1st of 2021, so long as certain steps are taken, including, as many of you know, there must be an attestation of hardship and also a payment of 25% of rent owed between September 1st, 2020 through February 1st, 2021. The law also makes it legal until February 1st, 2021, evictions where the landlord does not state a legally valid reason for an eviction. This law was needed, and as we know, even before the pandemic, families across the United States and across our state, across California, were struggling to afford safe, stable, affordable housing. Newly released census data shows that nearly 50% of households in California have lost employment income since March of 2020. And 1 in 5 households, or about 20%, indicate that they have no or slightly or only slightly or slight confidence. Let me re-say that. A new study shows that in California, most don't have confidence that they will be able to pay their mortgage or the rent the next month. And of course, this is all the result of the impact that COVID-19 has had in terms of employment and the economic crisis that it has created. The data also shows that in August, 14% of renters, or nearly 600,000 households, and 9% of owners with a mortgage in California were behind on their housing payment obligations. So AB 3088 was pivotal in providing protections for renters, for landlords, and also for homeowners. One piece of the puzzle has been ensuring that people know about the law. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge many of you who are with us today who have been partners with us in educating and sharing information and resources. Since the law was passed, our agency has developed a comprehensive set of resources and tools that have enabled thousands of Californians to stay housed. To date, we have had over 120,000 visits to the state's Housing is Key campaign website. Again, Housing is Key campaign website. It was a new website created to ensure that we were doing everything possible to provide the resources and information necessary to protect renters, homeowners, and small landlords. Over 57,000 downloads of documents, including the declaration of the COVID-19 documents, have been downloaded from the website. And also to assist individuals in navigating these new protections, we developed an application or an app in partnership with UC Irvine and also Neota Logic. This is an interactive web-based tool that allows for tenants to be able to access resources and receive the guidance necessary to avail themselves of the protections under AB 3088. These efforts have been the beginning of trying to help those that are most at risk for losing their homes. The second part of AB 3088 requires that our agency develop a framework with strategies and approaches to direct potential future federal stimulus funding to most effectively and efficiently provide relief to distressed households in our state. And this includes exploring strategies to create access to liquidity in partnership with financial institutions or other financial assistance. And therefore, we are here to initiate the stakeholder engagement process, and we need your input. We need your engagement. We know from our work in shaping the advanced housing planning effort that partnering with communities, with organizations, with folks that are on the ground working with families helps us inform and solve these complex issues impacting all Californians, but more specifically, vulnerable Californians. During the course of our engagement with shaping the advanced housing work, we created a framework around the 4 Ps, or basically the guide for coordinating our overall housing efforts. And basically the 4 components are protecting Californians, ensuring that we're doing everything possible to keep families housed, preserving and producing homes, continuing our efforts to preserve housing affordability and produce and expand the supply of affordable housing, strengthening and sustaining our comprehensive response to prevent and end homelessness, and then finally implementing people-centered strategies that are focused both on stability, job opportunity, and resiliency. For all 4 of these areas, an equity evaluation tool has been developed to guide our policy and program development. We know that recovering from this pandemic as a state will be a challenge on all levels. And in developing our recovery policies and programs in our response, it is our commitment to be equitable and inclusive, aiming to ensure that we're doing everything possible to eliminate racial and economic disparities in housing. That is why your feedback and your participation is so valuable to the work that we do. It helps guide and inform our policies, our work, as we continue to work in partnership with you to ensure that there is an improved quality of life and that everyone is able to stay housed or access stable, affordable housing. But we also know that we need the federal government to do their job to reach an agreement on a relief package that incorporates a bolder, multifaceted approach. We know that the livelihoods of many Californians are relying on it. And I'd like to ask for your continued advocacy and assistance in continuing the conversations in your communities. We are grateful for the work that you are doing every single day to protect and promote an equitable housing opportunities, to protect the most vulnerable and to be partners with us in this work. Now, we know that we need to elevate the importance of a relief package to continue to ensure that the most vulnerable and those that are entering poverty are also protected. As we begin to shift to this next phase, I invite you to continue to stay engaged, to share your input, to help problem solve with us, and to help us develop strategies that are inclusive and equitable, and that will lead to helping to prioritize future federal stimulus funds. With that, I'd like to now turn it over to our partner in the governor's office, Senior Counselor for Housing and Homelessness, Mr. Jason Elliott. Thank you.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Secretary. Just making sure you can hear me. All right, I'm coming through. So I appreciate everyone taking the time to be on the Zoom call this morning. I see we have about 280 participants, and I think that speaks to really the importance of the work that this group will undertake. So I think the framework for why we're here today has been pretty well laid out, so I won't repeat that. But AB 3088, which a number of people on this Zoom call helped us discuss and negotiate and finalize, really requires a very wide table as we work into the next phases here, because so many people are impacted by this eviction, foreclosure, and economic crisis that we're facing. It's not just tenants, it's not just landlords, it's homeowners, and it's the economy more broadly. So there are a number of stakeholders here, and I know we have some of our partners from the legislature on the call as well. And suffice it to say that we in the governor's office, and if I can be so presumptuous as to speak for our legislative partners, we understand there's a lot of work that remains to stabilize the rental market and to build back better. I think as we think about what we're doing here, obviously the potential eviction crisis, which 3088 gave us time now to sort of focus on how we can stabilize. We're not in the midst of what would have happened had 3088 not passed. But we have to keep our eye on the fact that there's a deep inequity in those who are facing potential eviction or back rent. And Lourdes, Secretary Castro Ramírez went through some of those statistics, but always to keep in the front of our minds, not the back of our minds, that this is not impacting people across California equally. And we have to be extremely sensitive to that reality. So then the question becomes, what do we do next? And during the conversations around AB 3088, which again, a number of you participated in, and through to today, the point continues to be raised that there was no relief money provided, not to tenants, and not to landlords as a part of AB 3088. Of course, that's absolutely right, but it also highlights the point that that's really what's needed here to help stabilize this very precarious situation. And as we all know, and we're all watching the news, there has not been a subsequent CARES Act after the one that was passed early in the pandemic, when the case for the need for that is so clear. And we're all watching the news today, and McConnell and Pelosi are talking, and Mnuchin, and everybody's talking, and they have to pass a bill by today, and what's going to happen. This is not just a political conversation. This is a conversation that impacts real people's lives. And I think what we were hoping process that BCSH is running is to think about how we would want to program future federal stimulus funds should they become available, and we remain confident that they will at some point become available. And I think it's not just a one-way conversation, though. It's not just what would we do if the federal government grants us the money we need. Let's also influence this conversation. We're California. The policy ideas and the leadership that we can provide can materially impact how the rest of this stimulus conversation in the rest of the country moves. So we have an opportunity not just to be passive recipients of federal support, but to advocate actively for what we think is right. And so I think this is really important to set this table, and it is a huge table, but it has to be a huge table because so many people are impacted. So I'll stop talking now, and I look forward to listening to this discussion and subsequent discussions. But I just want to leave everyone with a word of thank you for both your advocacy to get us to this point and for your best thinking moving forward as we try to work together to dig out of this crisis that we're potentially facing. Thank you very much. And I am going to participate and listen to the rest of the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Hey, my name is Irina Asmussen. I'm the chief economist at the California Department of Finance. And as such, I am responsible for looking after the economy of the state of California. And so as a setup to some of your comments, I wanted to remind everyone sort of what the backdrop is for our economy and particularly the housing market. So two things about the COVID pandemic. One is that we came into this with a structural problem on housing. This is a chart from the governor's budget before the pandemic, but this is meant to sort of show how the structural problem and the lack of housing in California has evolved over time. So this chart goes back all the way to 1980 to give you some perspective, and it looks at sort of how crowded California's housing is. And if you were to keep the size of the number of adults per household constant, how many housing units would you need in California? So if you go all the way back to 1980 and sort of like keep the crowdedness levels the same as in 1980, you would probably need about 2 million more housing units than we had in 2018. If you were to go back to about the crowdedness levels of 2010, which was after sort of the housing bubble ended, then you would have, you know, a deficit of around 500,000. All of this is trying to put some numbers to, we had a structural problem. We still have a structural problem. California's growth has been slow, population growth has been slowing, but we are still a very large state. And this is a problem for many, many households. In 2019, which was about as good as our economy has been in a very long time on aggregate measures, 1 in 5 California households paid at least 50% of their income in housing costs. That's 1 in 5. 20% of households paid 50%. That was when the unemployment rate was around 4%. Lots of people were employed, and then the pandemic hit. what we had been talking about before then was that if you're paying 50% of your income in housing costs, if one of the two of you ends up losing your job, then you're instantly on the edge of homelessness. That's the situation that we were in going into the pandemic. Can I go to the next slide? Okay, so this is kind of a complicated chart. This is from the May revision, but this to me encapsulates sort of the inequality in California that was exacerbated in the pandemic. So the size of the bubbles tells you the size of the sector in which there are jobs. And then the y-axis, how far up they are, that tells you the average wage in that sector. So this looks at 2020 relative to 2007 to see who was hit, what kinds of sectors were hit, what kinds of people and jobs were hit. And so you can see that retail, trade, leisure, and hospitality, no surprise, they lost a ton of jobs. People in those sectors also tend to be lower income people. You can see that health and educational services is now so much bigger than it was in 2007, even in 2020. That's in large part because we have an aging population. And then you can see there's a couple of fortunate sectors that are above that blue line, the horizontal blue line. That means that they're above average wages. Professional, scientific, and technical services, that's a lot of Silicon Valley jobs. Information services, that's also a lot of jobs. But almost everyone else, those sectors lost jobs. So there's this huge divergence in how California is doing, and there's a huge divergence in how California households are doing. So two lessons from this. One, we have problems that were pre-existing that we probably are not going to be able to fix with a little bit of extra federal stimulus. It can go in the right direction, but it can't fix everything. To really fix these structural problems, you're going to have bigger changes. And I hope that in the coming years, we'll be able to talk about those. But for the purposes of this discussion, I hope that we can think about and keep at the front of our minds, as Jason said, we have to understand that there were existing inequities and there were existing structural problems. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Irina. Good morning. I'm Lynn Von Koch-Liebert. I'm the Deputy Secretary of Housing at Business Consumer Service and Housing Agency. And with the next section, we're going to go over more about the stakeholder process and the engagement that we're going to be pursuing over the next coming weeks. So let's start with a couple polls. We're going to be talking a lot about two federal bills. And so we're just going to start by getting a little bit of understanding on folks' background information on both the CARES and the HEROES bills. So Veronica, if you want to do poll one. Okay, so how aware are you of the CARES Act? And this is the COVID-19 relief bill that was passed in March of 2020. Are you very aware, somewhat aware, or not aware?
Leave it open for about 5 more seconds.
Okay, great. We have a lot of awareness. That's great. Thank you. Okay, let's do one more quick poll. Okay, how aware are you of the current proposals and the negotiations between Congress and the White House around additional COVID-19 relief? Again, very aware, somewhat aware, or not aware? Okay, a little bit more mixed. So a little bit more of somewhat aware, a little bit less very aware, and some individuals who are not aware at all. Great. So that's just really helpful to know as we start this process. Okay. Veronica, if you can hold on just 1 second. Okay, great. Okay, thank you. All right, as mentioned earlier, the goal of this process is for us to receive stakeholder feedback to help inform on housing-related state decisions should the future federal COVID funding be available. So while we do not know precisely if, when, or how much the U.S. Congress will provide in future federal dollars to support the COVID response, as shown in phase 4, which is the yellow box on this chart, there have been 5 proposals that have been introduced, but none have yet been signed into law. The current federal negotiations are loosely between the HEROES Act 2.0, which is a $2.2 trillion bill introduced by the House Democrats, and the HEALS Act at $1 trillion, which is introduced by the Senate Republicans. And negotiations are currently in the range of 2.2 trillion and 1.8 trillion, and they do include housing-related provisions. But as mentioned previously, this is an extremely fluid situation, and we're monitoring it very closely. But should a bill be passed, we will need to be able to act quickly. And so for the purpose of this stakeholder engagement, we will be using the HEROES Act 2.0 as our structure, using the programs and the funding pots as the basis for feedback. Next slide. So we have created the HEROES Act funding distribution table, which is located at www.bcsh.ca.gov/AB3088. And this was to provide a high-level comprehensive understanding of the housing-related programs, estimated totals, eligible uses, and restrictions for those funding streams. We also showed the housing-related funds that were authorized earlier this year under the CARES Act. And this was done to give a better picture of the funds that have been provided to date. And I encourage you to view this document, particularly as an aid when completing the survey. Now, the table here on the slides gives a snapshot of the HEROES Act 2.0, which includes 5 housing-related funding streams that would be administered by the state, 4 of which are established programs via the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and 1, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is direct flexible resources to the state and local governments. Now, we will be focusing our engagement on the state allocation. Next slide, please. Okay, just to give you a quick overview of the process and timeline. So today is our kickoff meeting, and the survey will also be opening this morning via the SurveyMonkey platform, and will be live until October 30th at 5 p.m. The survey to the link is, again, at bcsh.ca.gov/AB3088. And once the survey closes, the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency and the Department of Finance will review and analyze the results with the target of completing and summarizing our key findings and recommendations by around November 12th. Now, as we mentioned before, this is all very fluid, and we see the survey as really a starting point of this process. But if we have more time, we will be including topical or stakeholder-specific workshops, discussions, or invitations to comment on additional components. Or if a bill is passed, then we'll do a laser focus on elements that may differ from the current proposals. But we understand that potentially tonight we'll have more information about what sort of timeline we're looking at. So we'll be continuing to post information on through our listservs and on our website to be able to communicate the next steps of this process. Now, the final deliverable that we're shooting for will be producing a memo that will provide feedback and recommendations to the governor's office for consideration. Now, for the survey, we will be using the SurveyMonkey platform to assist us in collection of this information. The survey is currently in English, but we're working on translating it into Spanish as well. We are asking everybody to identify yourselves. This is not going to be an anonymous survey. And we are assuming various levels of background, experience, and focus from stakeholders. So we've written the questions with 2 parts, a structured part and an open form part. For the structure, we include rankings, prioritization of lists and lists, and that allows for bigger picture feedback and also for those to be able to provide from pre-drafted answers. And then there will be an open form text. And this provides input in a more nuanced perspective, where you can provide feedback in places where you feel compelled to do so. And so other than identifying yourself, you may answer or skip as you think is appropriate. Okay, so in terms of supporting documents, we have created a number of documents to help get through this first stage of the process. So the first is a survey narrative, and this provides an overview of the legislative space, backgrounds on existing federal dollars, background information on the program, and relevant COVID-19 data. It also provides a more detailed explanation of the stakeholder engagement process and timeline, and then detailed instructions, which include definitions and links to other helpful information. The first appendix, which I mentioned earlier, is the high-level table that shows the CARES Act funding. This includes the program, the amounts, the eligible activities, and the current status of those dollars. And then we have the same for the HEROES Act 2.0. We've given a high-level overview of what has already been funded under CARES, and then also how the HEROES Act 2.0 proposes to spend housing-related resources. In this table, we show both the state and the local allocations. One of the big questions in this process is to receive feedback on the direct unprogrammed state coronavirus relief dollars to the state. We want to make sure that you have the full picture so that you can help us identify the gaps. Appendix 2 is also a PDF version of the survey itself so that you can review it, work with colleagues, think through the questions, and pre-write any text that you may need before entering into the SurveyMonkey to complete the survey. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the survey is broken up into 5 sections. The first section is the HEROES Act 2.0 defined housing-related programs. So this goes into an overview and asks questions on the programs that are administered through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The second section is specifically around the coronavirus relief funds, and those are the direct flexible resources to the state. The third section are the strategies and approaches to reach and assist the hardest hit by COVID-19. And the fourth section is on strategies and approaches to create access to liquidity in the market space. And finally, the fifth is planning for what next should AB 3088 expire in February without additional federal resources. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to show you very quickly what to expect when you're within the survey. So remember again that the narrative and the funding distribution table does provide instructions and information and is designed to support you as you work through the survey. So in section 1, for example, the stakeholders are invited to provide feedback on key areas within housing-related funding streams where the state has decision-making authority. So as a reminder, the programs will be the Emergency Solutions Grant Rental Assistance, Emergency Solution Grants HEROES Act, Community Development Block Grant HEROES, and the Homeowners Assistance Fund. It's important to remember that these are one-time and that they are separate and distinct from the annual programs of the same name. So for each of these programs, the survey includes 4 questions. And as each program has federal regulations, the questions are really focused on the places where the state does have some discretion. So the first question will be a prioritization within eligible uses of the funding. The second is an open text for other uses. So this may be places where there may be an option for a waiver or you have a different reading of the federal regulations. Okay, next slide. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. The third question is around your preferred method of distribution or allocation. So how should we best get these dollars out the door? And then the second is really explaining the allocation methodology that you're recommending. So we have an open form text for comments on why one method is preferable over others, limitations that we should know about, etc. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so section 2 is on the Coronavirus Relief Fund flexible dollars. So in HEROES Act, both state and local allocations, and both are listed clearly in the funding distribution table. And for the purpose of this engagement, we will be focusing on the state allocation and estimating several $1 billion may be available for housing-related purposes. So as the Secretary mentioned earlier, building on earlier planning efforts and the implementation of the CARES Coronavirus Relief Fund, the state has proposed a framework using the 4 Ps mentioned by the Secretary, protection, production, preservation, and people/employment, with a couple funding strategies for each element. So the first thing we're going to ask is for prioritization within these 4 Ps as it relates to the COVID crisis and the unmet or unanticipated need. And then secondly, for each of these sections, a prioritization of the proposed funding strategies. We've also left an open field here in case you think there's a key activity that has not been included that supports this framework. We also in this section have created a couple of guardrails and guidance points to make sure that the information will then be helpful in administration of the federal dollars. So the first is just this really note that the coronavirus relief resources should really be used to fill critical gaps. The second is a reminder that these are one-time resources with an expenditure date that will likely be 12 months. So we need to identify projects and services that can be achieved within this timeframe. And then when possible, these funds should target those who've been most heavily impacted by COVID and are facing the greatest instability. And finally, when possible, the CRF should be used to make one-time investments that will create longer-term or permanent solutions. For instance, jobs, capacity, capital, permanent housing outcomes, et cetera. Okay, and then finally, sections 3, 4, and 5 are open field text boxes to answer specific questions. Section 3 calls for specific strategies for reaching and assisting low-income tenants, small property owners, and affordable housing providers. Section 4 asks what the state can be doing from a regulatory and statutory perspective to help ensure the housing market and financial institutions have sufficient liquidity. It also calls for ideas for capital and innovative models. And finally, Section 5 asks the question of, if AB 3088 is to expire in February 2021 without additional federal funding, what policy changes should the state pursue to reduce evictions, foreclosures, and ensure that the solvency of the housing market? It also asks for particularly non-budgetary areas of concern that should be lifted up for our consideration. Okay, and then just wrapping up. So the survey was open this morning and is accessible via bcsh.ca.gov/AB3088, and it will close at close of business 5 p.m. on October 30th. As we learn more about the federal proposals, we will be posting and sharing next steps or additional requests for input on the same page, as well as emailing through our listserv. If you run into any issues or questions during this engagement process, please email housing@bcsh.ca.gov. And then also remember that for AB 3088 more broadly, you can visit housingIsKey.com for resources, tools, and information. And we just want to thank you in advance for taking the time to provide this input. We really appreciate and value your feedback in this process. And at this point, I will turn back to Veronica, who will be helping us field questions from the audience.
Veronica, you're muted. Thanks.
Well, we knew that would have to happen during a Zoom webinar, right? So thank you again to all of our panelists for the great information they provided today, and we definitely look forward to everybody's feedback. We did have some questions in our chat group, and we appreciate those, but we would definitely like to address those in longer form, and we'll provide a Q&A section on our website to answer those more in-depth questions. We do have one, and Lynn, maybe you can answer. We want to clarify, do you want one survey from each agency or multiple?
I think it would be appropriate to have one from agencies and organizations. That would be helpful to us to be able to distill the information.
Great. And so thank you for that. We will also be posting the PowerPoint onto the website that Lynn mentioned earlier at bcsh.ca.gov/AB3088. There are some materials already posted there, including the supportive documents Lynn mentioned and the link to the survey, but we will update it and add the PowerPoint because I know there were some charts in there that were very helpful. So thank you, everybody. We definitely look forward to your feedback. And if there aren't any other questions, we will go ahead and close out our webinar for today.
Veronica, just a quick question.
Yes.
If we have individuals on the line that would like to speak, is there a way to do that, or do they have to submit their question through the chat function?
Any of our attendees will have to submit their questions through the chat. Our panelists, if they'd like to make closing remarks, can go ahead and do so.
And Veronica, I see a couple of questions that I look like I can answer coming in on the chat. And
Yes.
so just clarification that one survey from each agency would be helpful to us to being able to distill the answers. And we'll see the results. So we will be reconvening this group again mid-November, where we will provide an outbrief on the results from the survey. And hopefully by that time, we will also have really clear understanding of what the next steps look like based off of both the federal proposals and then any areas that we have noticed in the survey that call and warrant for additional workshops or discussions with stakeholders.
Great. Well, thank you everybody very much, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to your feedback. Melania, the survey will be open for 10 days and will close on October 30th at 5 o'clock.
Just on behalf of agency and the administration, thank you all for joining us. We hope to see your ongoing sort of engagement through the survey, giving us feedback, and also to the extent that you can share the survey with local groups in your community. I think that would be very helpful. We are also exploring the opportunity to, or the ability to translate the survey into, at a minimum, Spanish. And so we will, once that is done, we will make sure that that is also uploaded to the website. Thank you all. Thank you, Veronica, for hosting this. And thank you to the team for pulling this together. Have a good day.